Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me today, and thank you for listening to me as well. I'm very excited to connect with people also in the next few days. I think this is a great occasion to meet new people, like-minded people. My name is Riccardo De Franceschi. I am originally from Milan, but based in London, where I work as a creative director at typeface design studio Dalton Maag. And today I will share our point of view on type, particularly with user interface and user experience in mind. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is to give a bit of context on who my colleagues and myself are and what we do at Dalton Maag. We are a team of about 50 people from 25 different countries, which may not seem as extraordinary as, say, 20 years ago, but I still think it's a very important part of my and our practice. We have about 30 years of experience, specifically in the field of typeface design, where to different typographic problems, we offer different solutions that fit a certain client or project. And that ranges from bespoke custom typefaces, which are developed from scratch for a client, to a library of retail typefaces that, on the other hand, one can license off the shelf and use for any project, to modifications of those library typefaces into something more ownable. And finally, we refine the typographic component of logotypes, existing logotypes. So in a nutshell, what we do when working on a custom typeface is this. We work closely with clients in order to help them develop a typeface that expresses their own voice. And here you see some of the companies that we were lucky enough to work with over the last few years. Now, a custom typeface not only involves a bespoke voice or expression, like we just saw, but also it involves building typographic systems that respond to the specific requirements of that brand. And here you see some of the custom typefaces that we produced in their natural habitat. Yeah, the displaying contents in a UI environment. And there, our approach should really be driven by the understanding that typography is a system of elements with precise structure, and that this structure is finalized to the reading experience of the user, who should always be at the focus of what we do. And this is nothing new, as this quote from Hermann Zapf, one of the most celebrated type designers of the last century, reminds us. Now, talking about UI and UX specifically, type is, if you think about it, at the core of any digital products and services that rely on reading, and therefore choosing the right type for a certain UX journey and using it best for the UI elements that support that journey is of fundamental importance. And that is precisely my purpose for today, which is basically suggesting aspects that we can use to our advantage in order to make the most out of this potential of type in UI and in UX. In order to do that, we will look, first of all, at accessibility. Secondly, at the functionality of fonts with the focus on variable fonts. Third, we will hint at the potential of type in AR and MR. Fourth, we will look at the hot topic of dark mode. And finally, we will have a look at the global potential of type to conclude. So let's start with a couple of elements of accessibility. Accessibility in typography can be seen as the intersection of these three areas. So we have legibility, which is how well I can distinguish an individual character for what it is. Readability, which is how comfortable to read is a passage of text. And finally, likability, which is how attracted I am with my own background specific to me by a certain typeface. And we can observe how these principles are translated into practice by comparing these two typefaces here. A custom typeface that we made for the BBC that you see at the bottom, and Helvetica at the top. And I'll point out just a couple of significant elements. A hook-shaped L can help disambiguation with uppercase I. I'm looking at the bottom left of the screen, and therefore enhance legibility, disambiguation. Open apertures in complex characters such as lowercase a and e, I'm looking now at the bottom right of the screen, can help readability, preserving clarity at smaller sizes. Now, such decisions have a positive impact that can actually be measured. The BBC, for instance, worked closely with the third-party organization called Sutherland Labs to test, among other aspects, the preference patterns of their users for the new typeface with positive results. And such design principles can be applied to a large type system as well, involving sans and serif across different weights and styles, that allow the type family to work successfully in application as different as this one and this one here, two very different words. And different weights and styles specifically allow to create the right hierarchy across different contents. See here the various components of the BBC ecosystem, as well as through different environments or platforms, mobile, web browser, TV, and so on. Which leads us nicely to the next area of interest for today, which is functionality, particularly with the potential of variable fonts in mind. Now, an understanding of the different environments that my fonts will be used in is very important. For instance, the adoption numbers of different operating systems is something that we should always keep an eye on. And while as a typeface design studio, we cannot control where our fonts will be used eventually, what we can do is optimize our fonts for different uses. For instance, for all our fonts, we provide 3 versions. Desktop files to be installed on your machine and used in Adobe or Office applications, but also app files to be embedded in apps, and web files to be called in web pages. And in the latter, where the file size is critical, we reduce the file size by stripping off redundant information without affecting the user experience, as the fonts stay fully functional for the requirements of that environment. But the file size saving is something like what you see on screen right now. Now, as users and as designers, we are all very, very familiar with the flash of unstyled text, as well as with the flash of invisible text, as well as with the fact that most users abandon a site if it takes too long to load. Fonts do play their part in this. When I access, for instance, this seemingly innocent web page, my browser needs to actually download several font files. Think of headings, subheadings, captions, and so on, which adds to the file size. Now, variable fonts can help there. And this is the cool thing, number one, about this technology, is that it allows me to access the different weights that you see on the left-hand side from one single font file that you see on the right, which results in a file size saving and therefore performance enhancement. And the cool thing, number two, is that a variable font gives me access not only to those 5 individual weights on the left, but in fact to all variations in between, which allows me to animate type in this fashion here through a weight and a width axis in this case, for instance, and lends itself to super interesting applications, such as this experiment here, where the camera of the MacBook Pro of my friend Pablo's is actually tracking the distance of his eyes from the screen. And type can adjust in weight and width as the distance changes, enhancing, therefore, the reading experience. So basically what we're talking about is responsive type that reacts to context. And I think this is a key aspect of interest that I will get back to soon. Now, when it comes to support for variable fonts, there has been a growth since their introduction 4 years ago, and all major operating systems, as well as all browsers, currently support the technology. And while some ground remains to be covered on apps such as the usual suspect Office, but also Figma, we can be sure that this technology will keep taking on in the years to come. Now, I would like to go back to that idea of responsive type that I mentioned just now, as it is very powerful if we think of AR and MR environments specifically, where devices allow us to interact with the surrounding environment through text displayed on a screen. There we can see how variable fonts have great potential for the future. For instance, in this experiment here, my variable font type on the line at the bottom adjusts on a width axis, the letters becoming wider to compensate for my reduced angle of vision as I move around the room with my goggles on. And here, in this other experiment, the variation actually happens at letter level. So the ones that are closer to my point of view get narrower, and the ones further away get wider, so that the word shape maintains optimal readability at all times, again, as I move around the room. Speaking about mixed reality, we have been working with Magic Leap that we have created a custom typeface for the brand of, and a version optimized for UI of that typeface, which was developed studying the typography on their devices, which was a slightly psychedelic experience, as you can see here with my friend Eduardo wearing the device itself. And it allowed us to establish some fundamental principles that we could then follow and translate into the UI typeface, which, as you see above here, maintains the personality of the brand typeface that you see at the bottom. Look, for instance, at that lowercase e with the round right-hand side. But it has specific adjustments, such as, for instance, a more relaxed letter spacing, which results in a more open feel that is beneficial in UI when it comes to setting text at smaller sizes, with the additional complexity in Magic Leap's case of a busy background of type in movement with the halation or blooming of white light effect as well. Note that type is typically set in that environment in white. And that leads us to one of the hot topics of the last couple of years, which is dark modes, which operating systems have been introducing with the advantages that we're all familiar with, but also with one known problem, which is the fact that letters appear stronger when set negative. Focus on the 23.4 million word in the central part of your screen. Compare left and right and see how the 23.4 million on the right looks thicker, stronger than the one on the left. And that is exactly the same font that you're looking at, but it is an optical effect. Type on negative looks stronger. What we have done is tackling this situation at font level, rather than leaving this to the user to worry about, through a type that we developed specifically for UI, released on our library in the summer that you can license, which is actually called dark mode, where we have provided each weight with two different versions or modes that can be used in order to obtain the same or maintain the same optical appearance across normal and dark modes, left and right, so that the presence of my text stays optically consistent. Note that there is no reflow in the text. And that is because the space occupied by the letters remains the same across the two versions. What changes is just the grade of the letters that become slightly lighter in the dark mode version, as we can appreciate through this magnifier on the right-hand side. And this typeface is available as variable font not only with the weight axis, but also with the dark mode axis. And we can link this dark mode axis with the color of the background, meaning the elevation level of my interface, for fine adjustment, as you see here on this screen. The last aspect that I'd like to conclude with today is that of the global potential of type. as technology brings us closer and closer wherever we are in the world, look at us today, connected from England to Georgia and beyond. We have to consider how a brand and the user experience translates over different markets, which means different languages, which means different writing systems as well. And translating visually from one writing system to another is not trivial. Even something like the fundamental distinction between sans and serif, which is kind of at the core of the Latin writing system, does not necessarily translate into other writing systems. For instance, serif are simply not part of the visual vocabulary of Devanagari, which is the script used to write Hindi. So rather than forcing serif elements into Devanagari, I must understand the corresponding stroke and contrast formation in the local tradition. This Latin sans that you see at the top left corresponds to monoline and constructed Devanagari letter shapes, top right. The Latin serif, bottom left, corresponds to more calligraphic and organic Devanagari shapes with no serifs. This applies to any style, in fact, and an understanding of the tradition of each writing system allows for proper multi-script design with the aim of giving the user the same emotional reaction and the same user experience. For instance, what you have been looking at here is the work we've done with Facebook for their camera app, that we developed a number of different styles, each in 8 different writing systems, so that the user, whether he or she is in India, China, Lebanon, England, can type the stories on Facebook with the same tone of voice. So to recap, just a couple of points that I like to kind of take away from today. Accessibility for type in digital environment builds on the principles established in many centuries of several centuries of print. So it's from there that we need to start. Technology, however, such as variable fonts, has great potential for type that is responsive to context, and I think this is really something to look out for the future, also in AR and MR. And finally, a deep understanding of each writing system is key to good UI and UX design across different regions and markets. And I'd like to leave you all with some resources that can help dig deeper into these topics. From top to bottom, a book about the principles of type design, one about the principles of typography, then the point of view of Apple with the lecture that they did this year at WWDC, and that of Google through their resources that they make available on material design. And finally, an article by my colleague Bianca Burning on variable fonts. And if you'd like to talk this or any of this further, do approach me. I'll be around on Pine, and I hope to meet many of you there. And I thank you all for your time, and thank again Touch for bringing us all together today.